Am I correct in thinking that pain and temperature sensation is going to enter this side here, the right side, through that dorsal root? It'll enter the dorsal horn, synapse on the secondary neuron, and those secondary neurons cross over here, and then they're ascending in that spinothalamic tract on the other side.
That's exactly right, and the name they happen to be called tract cells, and you're exactly right. They will come in the dorsal root, enter the spinal cord, and synapse here, cross over to the other side, and then ascend the rest of the way in the opposite side. So that's the spinothalamic tract.
And that's
pain
temperature
and deep pressure.
Okay. Isn't this, all of these tracks, aren't they really, well understood or more easily understood if you, visualize Brown-Séquard syndrome?
Yeah, I mean, Brown-Séquard syndrome is a very good way of discussing them because of the fact that it involves all of these tracks. It's a very rare syndrome, you should be aware of that, but it is, for illustration purposes, it's very good. It's a shame we don't have a model here of the entire spinal cord, or we could,
And here's one you made earlier, Children.
we do have a model of the entire spinal cord. So a Brown-Séquard syndrome would be an instance where you hemisected a lesion which hemisected, for example, a stab wound, which hemisected the spinal cord. In other words, you cut the spinal cord across, but only to the midline in that sort of fashion. Now, if you do that, obviously these tracks are present in both sides of the spinal cord, but what you're going to do is cut all of the tracks on one side. But because of the crossing pattern that some of the pathways have, in some cases they have not crossed, particularly the dorsal column, and in some cases they have, it produces a very interesting syndrome in the patient. For example, if you have a Brown-Séquard with a lesion, say, somewhere in the lower regions of the thoracic spinal cord, then any entering pain fibers below that level will have already crossed the spinal cord and are now ascending on the opposite side, whereas any normal tactile fibers ascending here in the dorsal column tract will be ipsilateral and will be ascending on the same side. Because of that, a Brown-Séquard syndrome will in fact disjoin those two. You will lose pain and temperature on the opposite side, but you will lose sensation on the ipsilateral side, below the level of the lesion, of course. Everything above the lesion will be as normal, reasonably, but everything below the lesion will be lost, as will the descending motor fibers on that side as well. So if you had a right hemisected cord at a level here, you would lose motor function on this side. You would have weakness and tending towards paralysis on the ipsilateral side. You would lose sensation on the ipsilateral side in terms of fine tactile sensation because of the dorsal column fibers, which have not crossed at that point. But because all of the pain and temperature fibers below that level have crossed to the other side, you in fact would lose pain and temperature from the opposite side. So a right hemisection would result in loss of pain and temperature from the left-hand side below the level of that lesion.
Okay, so if we pretended that this has happened to Marge, could you maybe map out?
Indeed. Well, if we
I'll hold this.
take Marge, for example, if I could just spin you around, Marge, a hemisected spinal cord at the level, for example, here in the thoracic region, would mean, if she had a left-handed lesion, would mean that she would be paralyzed below that level, or at least weakened certainly below that level on the ipsilateral side because of the descending majority thank you, of the corticospinal tract, which has not crossed. She would also lose tactile sensation on that ipsilateral side because of the ascending dorsal column medial lemniscal fibers, which have not crossed on that side. But she would lose pain and temperature from the opposite side because all of those fibers, as they enter the spinal cord, have crossed to the other side and are moving up the left-hand side from the right lower limb, for example.
Okay.
Of course, she would have preservation of all of those functions above the level of the lesion.
So essentially, we could feel up Marge on the left side and she wouldn't know about it,
and hit her with something hot on the right side, and she wouldn't know about it.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right.
And this is obviously
Nice
quite a rare thing to happen.
Oh yes, seeing a pure Brown-Sequard syndrome with a perfect hemisection of the cord is virtually unheard of.
Right.
But I mean, other lesions will give you different levels of disjunction of those two functions.
So really, from our point of view, it's just a useful way to
It's
try
a
and
very
understand
useful
these
way of
tracks.
understanding what happens. Yes.
Okay.
It also is useful from the standpoint that you have to realize that the cord stops at what
L1?
about L2,
L2.
L1, L1, L2
L1.
region, which means that from there on, it's the cauda equina, the descending roots, which are servicing all of these levels. What that means, of course, is that a transection in a region like that actually will not result in loss exactly at that level, because the portion of the spinal cord which serves lower levels is found down here, essentially. In other words, a transection at that level would only affect areas from, say, about that far and above, because the roots, the important thing is where the roots actually exit the cord. So cutting the cord there will not damage the roots which descend past it in order to reach lower levels here.
Mm-hmm.
I think sort of as a conclusion to the discussion that we've had this afternoon, we could maybe go over the basal ganglia.
Yes, basal ganglia, quite complicated, related set of structures, gray matter structures deep in the brain. If we take the cerebral hemisphere, upper portions away, what we see, of course, are the ventricles we saw already. If we further disassemble the brain so that we're actually in the deepest portions of the brain, we'll literally take this region out, throwing away the cerebellum as well as the remainder of the occipital cortex, and we're left with essentially the very deepest portions of the brain. It turns out there are small areas of cortex associated with this called the insula. That's not particularly something we need to worry about, but if we remove those bits of cortex from either side, now we have really gotten to the very deepest regions of the telencephalon, the cerebral hemispheres. And what we can see are some gray matter structures located in those areas. And the first of those is the caudate nucleus. And the caudate nucleus is intimately associated, with the ventricle. You can see the lateral ventricle curving around here and projecting back into the occipital pole. And there is the caudate nucleus winding its way around and accompanying that ventricle. From there, the head of the caudate, the body of the caudate, and the tail of the caudate here. Located adjacent to that is a sort of lump of gray matter, which has intervening between it and the caudate, the internal capsule, which is represented by these white structures, and that is the lentiform nucleus. And what we're looking at here is the putamen, which is the lateral portion of the caudate nucleus.
Can I?
Sorry, the lentiform nucleus. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you very much.
Silly question, but grey matter here, but it's deep in the brain.
Yes.
Just gets there through folding. That's just how.
Exactly right.
That's
It's just a matter of development. That's exactly right. You think of gray matter as being the stuff on the outside margins of the cerebral cortex, but there are a number of very important, substantial gray matter areas deep within the cerebral hemispheres, including the basal ganglia, and very, very importantly, of course, the thalamus, which sits medially to these structures.
So the thalamus is also classed as grey matter.
Thalamus is also
Okay.
classed as gray matter because, in fact, it's the neuronal cell bodies rather than just their processes, as would be the case in white matter. We can further disassemble this, I believe, at least. I'm breaking this.
Don't break my model.
No, I don't want to break your model. This, there we go. And if we further disassemble this, we can see the caudate nucleus from the inner aspect winding around the margin of where the ventricle would have been. As you'll recall from the lectures, the lentiform nucleus here is made up of two structures. I said that this lateral aspect is the putamen. The medial aspect to this, which unfortunately we cannot see, but which lies just medial to it, would be the globus pallidus. All these structures form a portion of the basal ganglia. There are a couple of other structures, one in the midbrain, which is absolutely critical to understanding the basal ganglia, and that's the substantia nigra. There's another structure called the subthalamic nucleus, which sits just below the thalamus in the midline, Unfortunately, these are buried structures that are not shown on the model, but are critical components of the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia, of course, has as its role two things generally. Number one, it dampens unwanted movements, and number two, it accentuates or amplifies wanted movements. As in when you want to make a movement, one of the roles of the basal ganglia is to activate and amplify that action.
And that's the direct and indirect pathways?
Yes, there are two, in terms of wiring diagrams, there are two pathways through, from the cortex to the basal ganglia, back to the thalamus, and then back to the cortex as a sort of feedback loop. And there are two ways of traversing that feedback loop. And that is particularly, so the cortex will talk to the striatum, the caudate, or the putamen. The putamen will then talk to the globus pallidus. The globus pallidus will then talk back to the thalamus, and the thalamus will talk back to the cortex. You can go through that in two ways. The direct pathway is an excitatory pathway and does the job of accentuating movements that you do want to occur, and the indirect pathway through that whole loop has the exact opposite job. Its job is to inhibit unwanted activity by inhibiting the thalamus and the feedback to the cortex.
Right. Do you think these plasticine models might help us understand the basal ganglia further? Someone want to take us through these?
I'd like to try and build up a three-dimensional picture with the pieces of plasticine of the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the internal capsule. Mm-hmm. So Imogen, you've just put the thalamus in situ. Now that's right in the center of the brain, one on each side. This is the right thalamus, so the ventricle would be over here and the third ventricle in the middle. This is anterior, this is posterior. Now just lateral to that and wrapping around it, bring in the caudate nucleus, Paul, please. So we've got the caudate intimately associated with the thalamus, with its head, body and tail, and just lateral to that, Marge, can you give us the lentiform nucleus slightly lower and further laterally? Now the internal capsule, if we think just motor fibers initially, is made of those motor fibers descending from the cortex. Fraser, if you could be a cortex, and our fibers are descending here. So we've got the cortex up above. These motor fibers are descending in the corona radiata. They're tending to focus together in the internal capsule that is encapsulating the thalamus and the caudate, but is medial to the lentiform. And then as we pass through the internal capsule, cluster those fibers together. If we can just see past your hand there, Paul, cluster the fibers together, forming the cerebral peduncle. Now, before we leave that picture, we should comment that ascending sensory fibers come from the thalamus and enter the internal capsule and ascend to the sensory aspect of the cortex. And that means that injuries in the internal capsule here have far-ranging effects for both motor and sensory function on the opposite side of the body.
Great. And always finish with a pretty picture. Our pretty picture for today is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And what has that got to do with neurology? Well, there is a theory that Michelangelo intended for that to be the brain. So does that convince our anatomists that that is in fact a brain?
Absolutely.
There's an awful lot of function going on in there, and you can almost imagine the brainstem.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's the cerebellum. So.
Okay, so
Fantastic.
yeah, great.
So thank everyone for watching. Thank you for telling us lots of interesting things, and hopefully there will be more of this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Put your
Thank
feedback
you.
up and we'll do some more.